You are listening to In Studio from Simply Timeless. I'm Jay Daniels. Each week you join us as we bring you timeless songs. But really, what makes those songs timeless? Is it because of their age, or is there something deeper within them? We explore that idea with violinist Aaron Weinstein. His latest album is called 3 by 3. We'll talk about the album as well as his musical collaborations with the late Bucky Pizzarelli. But first, we're going to talk about something very near and dear to Aaron: bow ties. Aaron, you are a self-described bow tie rights activist. When did you receive your first bow tie?
I received my first bow tie. I was in my teens. I didn't know how to tie it, but I liked how it looked.
Do you have a preference for bow ties then over neckties?
At this point, I do. I still have a lot of long ties, neckties, which I do wear from time to time, just to show my range.
So what are your thoughts on clip-on bow ties?
Well, let me address that first part. You haven't learned to tie a bow tie. You know, there's a fantastic tutorial by someone named Aaron Weinstein that you can find on YouTube. It's in conjunction actually with a theoretical mandolin course that I taught and teach. But as a kind of bonus, there's a bow tie tying video. So if you type in my name and how to tie a bow tie, you'll find out how to tie a bow tie. So that's the first step, and that's free for your amusement and enjoyment. My thoughts on clip-ons are that if it's an event where you have to tie a bow tie, where you have to wear a bow tie, if it's a black tie event and you don't know how to tie a bow tie, put on a clip-on. If you're wearing a clip-on by choice, I think it might be something you want to talk to your psychiatrist about.
I'm going to have to make an appointment then over the next few days, I think, for one of those virtual sessions.
Yeah, Zoom, sure.
Yes. Years ago, and we will talk about music in just a moment, but years ago, my dad still does not know how to tie his own necktie. Apparently he was never taught. So I had to go to YouTube to learn how to tie a tie, and thank God I was able to learn because, every day I got to wear a tie somewhere. And I remember one time he called me on the phone and he says, "Look, I need help." I said, "Well, what do you need help with?" He says, "I need help tying a tie." And I'm trying to walk him through over the phone, and Aaron, it just did not work out.
But the thing about it is that, I wear a tie about every day, and it sounds like you do as well. And therefore, we probably know how to tie the tie that we're wearing every day. There's a lot of people for whom neckties, bow ties are not part of their daily life. They don't like them. They don't have to wear them. And so therefore they don't know how to tie them. And I think that's fine. I mean, there's no judgment if someone doesn't know how to tie a bow tie. I think sometimes people think it's some comment on their sophistication or anything, and it's just not. All it means is that they don't wear a tie, and that's totally fine. And that's what I have to say about that.
So let's talk music. Did you come from a musical family, Aaron?
I came from a family that liked music. My father's played guitar since he was a teenager as a hobby. But no one in my family is a professional musician. So
did you have any siblings, or were you an only child growing up?
I'm a middle child. I have an older brother and a younger sister.
Your family, as you mentioned, they were not performers in their own right, and I do want to hear about how you came to be one who did more than just listen, but who were some of the artists and composers that you were hearing as you were growing up?
My parents are former hippies, and so there was a lot of their music, played 60s rock and roll, 70s rock and roll, but they had wide-ranging tastes. So there was a bit of opera, not a lot. There was a little bit of jazz, a fair amount of country music and acoustic blues. But it was basically the music that they grew up listening to, which I think is what most people enjoy hearing, is the music that they grew up listening to.
With regard to the jazz music, that is clearly what many people know you for in your performances now. When did you make the transition from being a passive listener to an active listener, one that was engaged with jazz music and really letting it play a role in your life?
Well, I had been playing the violin and I'd been playing a style called old-time fiddle music, and going to rural parts of, I'm from Chicago, rural parts of the Midwest, mostly Missouri, and seeking out these old-time fiddlers and learning from them. And when I was about 12 or 13, I found a recording in a drawer in my parents' home, of Joe Venuti, the great jazz violinist. And had I looked in a different drawer, I would have found maybe something else that would have scarred me for life. But there was the right drawer at the right time. And I listened to this cassette tape, and it effectively changed my life. Hearing Joe Venuti, I'd never really heard jazz in an active way, even though there were a few Thelonious Monk records that were in my parents' collection. This was the first time I was really listening to jazz, and it happened to be a violin player, and it happened to be the first great violinist in jazz. So that was all really fortuitous.
I love the fact that you were so involved with the old time sort of music. It reminds me of that movie, Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, that the Coen brothers did several years ago, talking about this old timey music. And I grew up on bluegrass. I grew up in Central Virginia. We had a bluegrass festival every year in our hometown. What are some of the difference between the playing styles and techniques, say, between the old time fiddling that you were familiar with and then something that might be called jazz violin?
Oh gosh, I mean, everything is different. The instrument is the same. It's tuned the same. It's there's a violin, there's a bow, but within the style of old time fiddling, there's umpteen different ways to do it, and the same could be said for jazz. So the question you're asking is such a massive question. I think I would exhaust the time that we have to answer it. It's like anything. It's a different language. There are certain kind of tech. I mean, if you really look deep enough, you could find a link between anything. But there are certain similarities, but there are more differences to my ear than similarities.
Now, were you taking formal training for jazz violin at this point?
Not really. There were. I'm primarily self-taught. When I was playing old-time fiddle music, there were fiddlers who I would sit with, and they would show me tunes. But there was no real talk of technique, no real talk of here's how you hold the bow, here's how you hold the violin. Don't do that. It's gonna cause trouble for you later on. And as a result, I've developed and broken lots and lots of bad habits as a violinist. In terms of jazz, there were certainly key musicians who guided me in directions. There was a mandolinist named Don Sternberg, who I started working with in high school, learning to play the mandolin, but because it was jazz mandolin, there was a lot of kind of improvisation guidance, for lack of a better term, and that was incredibly helpful to me.
What led you to study at Berkeley?
They made me an offer I couldn't refuse.
Yeah.
So, it made the decision very easy.
Well, I want to focus on some of your education that you received there.
Sure.
Who were some of your mentors and teachers there at the Berkeley College of Music?
Well, at Berkeley was really the place where the idea of arranging came into my consciousness. And there was a guy named Bill Elliott, who is a brilliant arranger. In fact, one of the Sinatra records that Michael Feinstein did, I think he wrote the charts for that. And he really opened up a lot of notions of arranging. And, that was kind of the track that I found most beneficial at Berkeley, because there's things you can actually learn in a classroom about arranging. And, being in a classroom and learning about playing a solo, I feel while there's certain things you can maybe work on, it's not the most effective place to be practicing playing jazz. Being on stage is the place to do that. But the thing that Berkeley I found most beneficial was the kind of the orchestration and the arranging and the things that you can really look at in a classroom.
Was the thought going through your mind at this point that this would be your full-time profession, or was there something else that you had in mind as far as a career?
No, the thought was that I wanted to play music. In fact, originally I didn't even want to go to college. I just wanted to go to New York. And the reason that I did go to Berkeley is because the one thing that my parents have ever kind of imposed upon me is that I need to get a degree from somewhere. They didn't care where. They did care that I spent 4 years somewhere. And there were times when I wanted to quit school and move to New York, especially because during my 4 years at Berkeley, I was going to New York, sometimes quite a bit. And kind of the juxtaposition between going to New York, doing the thing I want to be doing, being on stage with my heroes, basically, and then Monday morning having to go back to class. It was very difficult at times to justify in my own kind of foolish mind why I should be at school. I'm very glad I stayed. But yeah, I wanted to, I couldn't wait for school to be done so I could start, effectively start my life.
In thinking about your learning on the job, and that's one thing that you stressed quite a bit in your own story on the website, was that some of the greatest lessons that you learned, you learned from these jazz masters, these mentors on the job. And there is one in particular I want to discuss with you, and we lost him just a few weeks ago, quite the statesman in the world of jazz, and you know who I'm speaking of when I mention the guitarist Bucky Pizzarelli. How did you two meet initially?
When I was 15 or 16, I was interested in jazz. I was playing it in my own capacity. I didn't have a great deal of guidance. I had some, but I wanted more. And I thought, where do I go? Who do I ask? And I just figured, let me ask the people who I revere. And I made a little demo tape. I think it was actually a cassette tape. And I sent it to all of my favorite musicians who were still alive, whose addresses I could find. And it was slightly before you could just go on Google and basically in 5 minutes find anything you want. So it took a little digging, some more than others. But Bucky was certainly one of my heroes, and his address was very findable. And so I basically sent him the recording of myself playing a few tunes and a letter saying that I would love to hear any criticisms, any ideas that he thought could be helpful to me. And, thank you so much in advance. And I sent a similar letter to his son, John Pizzarelli. And John responded. He called my parents' home when I was in high school and was so wildly enthusiastic and encouraging. Certainly more so than the music warranted, I promise you. But to get a call like that from someone like that meant everything to me. It was the first validation of that type I'd received from someone of that pantheon. And it just, to me, it just told me that I was doing something okay, like I was on the right path. And through John, I met Bucky. I was in New Jersey working at a summer jazz workshop. And John called me and he said, Bucky's playing at this club in New Jersey and he's waiting for you to sit in, so go. And, he called it as the gig was happening. And so I got there as Bucky was finishing, and literally he was finishing his last song of the night, and he sees me walk in and he makes everyone in the place stay seated. and he calls me over and we play a few tunes, which is the thrill of my life. And he says, "What are you doing Tuesday?" And he puts me on a concert with him.
Your association with the Pizzarelli family has continued for several years after that. In fact, I need to make sure I have my information correct. You were 19 when you released your debut album for Arbors. Is that right?
That sounds right, yeah.
So the name of the album, A Handful of Stars, and I think that might be a play on words, you can tell me, but it features not only Bucky, but also John Pizzarelli, along with the bassist Nicky Perrott and drummer Joe Ascione.
And Houston Person.
That's right. Saxophonist Houston Person was on there, too. How did I forget to write his name down, too? The opportunities seem to come your way, and I think it's because you deserve them and you worked for them. Would you mentioned this word validation, receiving a response from John and then playing with Bucky as a sort of validation. As one who grew up listening to these sort of artists, I mean, even when you were 19 and still in college recording, did you think that you would have the opportunity to record with those jazz artists as you did?
No, I'm absolutely not. My association with Bucky and John and the way it kind of grew happened relatively quickly. Before I had met Bucky, there was a situation, an opportunity where I was going to come to New York to play on a festival where he would also be part of it. And I thought, I jumped at the opportunity, even though they weren't paying for my flight or anything. But I thought, this is my chance to work with my heroes. So I'll do whatever I need to make that happen. And between the time I accepted that engagement and the engagement actually happening, not only I had just by chance met Bucky and worked with him, but also recorded with him for the first time. And so he had become a friend by the time, I had what I thought would be meeting him. And so, there was no way to know that would happen, or to know that, I met him when I was 16, and I worked with him until he passed. I feel so lucky for that to have happened. And he probably taught me more about both the musical and the non-musical aspects of being a jazz musician than maybe anyone else. I would never have guessed that I would even have met him. I mean, listening to these people on records in my childhood bedroom growing up, they're mythical figures to me. It's odd to even meet them, to be in their presence. For me, I get very easily starstruck, and these are my stars. And so, no, I would never, any more than I would think I would meet Zeus. I mean, of course not. He's mythical. To me, Bucky Pizzarelli was mythical.
And the same has happened to me because, I grew up in Virginia. We were not really exposed to jazz. And then the more I would listen, the more I'd fall in love with it. And 3 years ago when I started this little radio show, I mean, it's something I'd wanted to do for a while, but never thought that it would bring me to work in New York and to meet the very people that I'm featuring. And like this week, I emailed, basically I went through our roster of artists, including yourself, and I said, who do I want to talk to? Whose stories do I want to hear? And so I put emails out that I did not think would get returned. And earlier this week, I talked to another one of your collaborators, Dick Hyman.
I mean, how about one of my heroes? Let's say that.
Yeah, and then immediately after I talked to Mr. Hyman, I talked to a fellow whose music I have known since I was a kid, Ramsey Lewis.
Amazing.
And to hear their stories, and what is very interesting is they speak of these serendipitous occasions, these opportunities that came their way. And I was reading a review for your debut album, and one writer dubbed A Handful of Stars as the rebirth of the hot jazz violin. And I'm going to ask you to provide a definition here. What would be a proper description for hot jazz violin?
First of all, the person who said that was Nat Hentoff. I don't have reviews cataloged, but I have his review cataloged because, In the same way that Bucky Pizzarelli was a hero of mine, Nat Hentoff, he's someone whose books I had read about jazz from the time I was first listening to people like Bucky Pizzarelli. And that too, to have the opportunity to get to talk to him about jazz, but also, in the context of him writing about me, that was just so bizarre.
Yeah.
I mean, all I wanted to talk to him about was, what did Duke Ellington tell you, and what was it like to be around Charlie Parker? And here he's trying to get his information so he could write a story. I mean, we had we had different agendas for those phone calls, but So Nat wrote that, and whatever he says goes. So sure. Hot jazz violin, I think what he's talking about is it's a style that, these terms for styles are terms that critics come up with in the time. I've read that about the term bebop, things like that. The creators of bebop did not call it bebop. But a hot jazz violin is basically, my understanding of it is like, what early Joe Venuti is.
And your recent album showcases that beautiful sound. It's your debut for Chesky Records. It was released last year. An album called 3x3, and it features you on the violin along with Matt Monasteri on guitar and Tom Hubbard on bass. And, you really dig deep into the jazz archives, like some of the original standards from the early half of the 20th century, like Chinatown, My Chinatown, the St. Louis Blues, Back Home Again in Indiana. And I really like to speak with artists about their thoughts on this, because those are songs that I have records of Louis Armstrong performing those many, many years ago. Mm-hmm. And these are songs that, are released fairly regularly over the decades. Mm-hmm. And here you are in your mid-30s, one who certainly came after these songs were well past what was considered their prime, I guess. And yet here you bring these songs into a new light in the 21st century. Let me ask you this. How do you feel that your unique talents help contribute to the overall musical conversation here in 2020?
Well, first, the reason that kind of repertoire was on that record is because the label wanted to focus on music, on songs from that era. So that's what was guiding that. You said something about these songs being past their prime, and I'm not so sure about that. I think a good song, if it was good in 1940, it's still a good song. The minute I think a musician starts looking at music in terms of its old music or its new music, I think it's a missed opportunity. Just because After You've Gone was written in 1928 or 29, it's material. And we have the same notes to work with in 2020 that we did in 1920. So I think the idea of things being old or new or past due or things like that is, that's just, I won't pass judgment. It's not the way I look at things. I think music being categorized by time period, unless you're talking about recordings from historical time periods, if you're talking about playing styles, it's somewhat negligible because, if you look at, bebop was in the 50s, Giant Steps was in the 60s, and it was 1960 to now is 60, 70, 80, 90, 2000. So it's like 60 years old. No one would call Giant Steps old music, but something from the 40s I've heard people call old music. So when you look at that, that's a 20-year difference. Is that the definition? There's a 20-year gap between old and new. It gets very kind of absurd when you start to think about the dates of these things, and that's why I don't think it's terribly beneficial to think about music in those terms. So, the way I see it is it's material. I've listened to recordings, and the style in which I play is certainly influenced by recordings and musicians who came of age at specific times. But the truth of the matter is, if you're talking about that recording, I guess it was recorded in the last year, and that's pretty modern. So,
Yeah.
so that's kind of how I see that.
I think you hit on something which we could do an entire interview on this, and maybe my choice of words of being past their prime was wrong, but it helped you even ignite another thought, which I will not get into.
Oh, get into it.
I've got 10 minutes. I don't know if I have time. When we started this program, when we assigned the name Simply Timeless, the question that we continue to ask even after having done 3 years worth of shows, what makes certain songs timeless? I almost think I use this term all the time. I used it with Ramsey Lewis on Wednesday. There's a format called oldies, and it's specifically from 1954 to 1969, or maybe. And I have really had a struggle with those terms that you mentioned, old and new. Mm-hmm. What I like to look at it is like classic and contemporary, But then again, how does one define contemporary works? How does one define classic?
That's exactly right. And so, it's in the same sort of camp as the question of, people, critics love getting together and talking about this. It was Sinatra a jazz singer? And
there's a discussion right there.
Yeah, and we could hear all sorts of views, but the bottom line is, does it matter whether you call him a jazz singer or not? Why don't you just listen to the records and talk about if you like those records or not? But I mean, the classification, I think, is so much less important than the music itself. If you want to talk about the actual music, do you like it? Do you not? Why? What do you actually think about it? Sure, but classifying it, I'm not terribly interested in that, because I don't quite know what anyone gets out of it, other than knowing what bin to put it in record stores. But there's no more record stores, so it's not even worth that.
Well, and here's what I have to say, because we straddle that fence at Simply Timeless between jazz and pop all the time. And someone will say, well, that's not jazz, that's pop. I'm like, is it? And my response to that is, good music is just good music.
I think Duke Ellington said that, right? There's two kinds of music, good and bad.
That's right.
He knew what he was talking about.
He did.
In terms of what makes a song timeless, first of all, I think you need to define the term. What is timeless? But if you're talking about quality, you're talking about the melody, the lyric, and the harmony. There's great songs that are kind of have fallen out of favor or never became popular. The reason why, there can be cultural reasons. There could be all sorts of reasons. It doesn't mean it's not a good song.
As one in your mid-30s, how does this music, whether it was made yesterday or it was made, a century ago, let's not even worry about that. But as one in your mid-30s, how does this music that we've discussed resonate so deeply with you?
I don't think age has anything to do with it. The fact that I'm in my 30s, I don't think matters, because in my circumstances, because this music, I started really listening to it, when I was a teenager. The same could be said for a lot of musicians who are now maybe in their 70s. They were also listening to the same records that I was listening to when they were a teenager. It was a different year, but part of the reason that John Pizzarelli and I have been able to, when we play together, we seem to be on the same page, and we've realized that when we were teenagers, we were listening to the exact same recordings. Now, those recordings happened to be his father, and Bucky was not my father, but they were the same. They were the same recordings, and therefore there's a similar musical reference point. And that's the great thing about this music. It's why I think I've had the opportunities to play with these masters who are so much better and older and more experienced than me. But the link is that we have a similar musical reference because we've listened to those same records. Of course, they're closer to the music. Maybe they're on those records that I'm listening to. But it's about a musical point of view. It's not really about the age of the listener, I don't think.
I have one more question for you, and I hope that we'll have this honor again to continue this discussion. I think we've opened a Pandora's box of conversation. One more for today. Why music?
Why not music? No, I mean I'm not being facetious. I mean, why wouldn't there be? Why wouldn't I play music? It's what I do. It's one of the things I do. It was never a thought that I want to be a musician. It's something that I did, and it's something I continued doing, and hopefully I will continue doing. It's part of the day. It's part of my life.
Aaron Weinstein, our guest this week during In Studio from Simply Timeless. His album is called 3x3, and you can find out more about it on aaronweinstein.net. Special thanks to Aaron and also to you for joining us this week. Until next time, I'm Jay Daniels. This is In Studio from Simply Timeless.